Welcome to the Jacob Edwards Library. We are here this evening in the reading room and we have two guests. We have Sarah Jo Burke, who's here, with me here on my right, and Karen Reichel. And they have both been involved in the production of Don't Think It Hasn't Been Fun, which is a book and also an audiobook more recently. And that's what we're here this evening to talk about, the life of the Burke Family Singers. And I'm going to turn it over to Karen to maybe give further explanation. But this book is a real trove of information about what it was like in the 1960s and 70s, or late 50s and 60s in the United States, which I wasn't here at that time, so it gives me a really nice view of that, and to maybe some of the highlights of being involved in some of the national productions, such as the Ed Sullivan Show, amongst others. So
it's also kind of a great travelogue, Margaret, if you haven't been in the country at that point.
Correct.
You know. I just wanted to say thank you for coming, and thank you so much for having us at the Jacob Edwards Library. And Ashley, thank you for helping us to set up. What we're going to do is, when we first did the book, the print book, people would say...
That was published in 2003.
Okay.
And the audio book, a lot of people who read the book asked us, well, what did you sound like? So we decided to make an audio book of it using 36 clips of Burke Family Singers music all the way through it. And we're both proud of it.
So I just wanted to tell you that tonight what we'll do is Sarah will talk a bit about her experiences with the family, and I've prepared some clips of from the audiobook along with pictures, a slideshow with each one. So I'll flip in and put those on at the appropriate moments, just so you know that she'll be talking, she'll be reading from the book, and then I will play some of the slideshows.
Thank you.
That's what we're up to.
Sounds good.
Enjoy.
Okay. This whole story started with the Christmas lights back in 1991. Actually, it really started when my mother and dad met each other back in 1935. Dad was playing piano for a fashion show that Mom was modeling in. Mom said they fell in love at first sight. She faltered in her march down the aisle at the same time that he saw her and blatted out the wrong note on the piano. To hear her tell it, there was such a charge in the air that lighting a cigarette anywhere in the vicinity of that at that moment would have been a really bad idea. Let me tell you a little bit about who my parents were. Mother was from an up-and-coming Boston Irish family. She attended the Notre Dame Academy on the Charles River. She successfully ignored the whistles of the Harvard and Boston University sculling teams on her way to school, and was not daunted by the local Dorchester boys who would look up as she passed by and say, "How's the weather up there?" That was Mom in a nutshell. My father was another story entirely. He was a very talented musician. He was the oldest of 6 kids, and he started playing piano really early in life. His parents met at the New England Conservatory of Music. His father was on a scholarship for piano and his mother was on a scholarship for voice. And they had the 6 children who were all singers, dancers, and instrumentalists. My parents got married 5 years after that walk down the aisle, and they had 10 children in 13 years. Now, my father should have had 2 or 3 at the most. But my mother got just what she wanted. When she was in grammar school, one of the nuns asked them what they wanted to do or be when they grew up. And my mother said, well, I'd like to have 10 children, 5 girls and 5 boys, and I'd like to travel And the nun looked at her and said, Ann dear, those two things don't go together. But in my mother's life, they did. They did. She traveled quite a bit. That's who they were in very briefly. My father died in 1977, and my mother died in 1999. And for 22 years, no matter where I was, I'd bus in or flew to Mom's house, and I'd stay for 2 weeks, and we'd get a Christmas tree and decorate it, and we'd play 500 rummy. We were very good friends. I'm the short girl in all the slideshows. So my mother had more time for me than she had for, say, some of the older kids, because there were just babies coming, and the older ones in the family had to, the two oldest girls primarily were Mom's helpers, because she just didn't have enough hands for all of it. My father had a swing orchestra called the Burke Brothers Orchestra, and during World War II, he needed to make more money because he had 4 children, and you know, piano lessons and swing bands there wasn't a big call for them once the war started. So he took a job as a heavy rigger at the Bethlehem Steel shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts. And one night, Christmas Eve, New Year's Eve night, the guy that was the crane operator thought he got the word to drop a 2.5-ton condenser onto the flatbed. And my father couldn't get his right hand out of the way in time, and it broke pretty much every bone in his hand. And so he never had the stretch after that to play, you know, concert piano. He just didn't have the stretch that he needed to do the type of piano playing he was doing. So he became a church organist, and their first house, I was not around because I'm the 9th of 10, but it was a small house. 5 girls were in one bedroom, 4 boys in another, with a boy in the corridor on a cot, and my parents' bedroom. And
Tell them about the bathroom. The bathroom in that.
the bathroom, there was often a line to get in there because there was just one bathroom. And tell about the bathroom. My mother spent more time in that bathroom than anybody, really. Let me read a bit about this. She was especially familiar with the contours of the bathtub because that was where she washed all the laundry. She used a broom handle stick to move the heavy towels, sheets, diapers, and clothes around before she scrubbed them on a washboard. Then she wrung them through a roller attached to the edge of the bathtub and hung them out to dry. This was usually on a Saturday morning. By Saturday night, all 10 kids had been in that same tub for baths and a hair wash. One of Mom's notations sums up her Saturday nights. It was written when she had only 8 children. Saturday, 8 baths, 80 toenails, 80 fingernails, 16 ears, 8 noses, 8 head washes, banana curls, confessions. I meant to say earlier that my mother went down to get the Christmas lights one Christmas, and instead of the Christmas lights, she came up with this box and she threw it on the kitchen table where I was sitting and said, "Do you know what these are?" And she was really excited. And I looked at them, and I didn't know at first, but then I saw some later. There were notepads, about 12 of them, and the kind where you make a list of eggs, bread, and butter, that sort of thing. But my mother wrote something. She would notate what if something touched her, like this: if you forgive people enough, you belong to them, whether either person likes it or not. Squatters' rights of heart, James Hilton. And she wrote down recipes and Christmas cards sent and received, and The second half of these notepads were a daily log of all the tours. My family sang for 12 years, and we did 7 tours. Well, the last one was just for a week, but the 6 before that were for a month or a month and a half at a time. I'm getting ahead of myself here. But we lived hard, especially the 5 boys. My brother Walter was accident prone, although he will deny that. My father kept a yellow lawyer's tablet with the names of all the doctors that he owed money to, and he tried to pay $5 or $10 a month to each doctor. And most of them were on a first name basis with my brother Walter. He got hit by a short line bus, his head bounced into the curb, and he went back into the bus, and he was on the danger list at South County Hospital for 6 or 7 weeks. And he lived through that, and he did other things. And I write about him a lot because he's really fun and easy to write about, because he was crazy. He didn't labor under the fear of death that keeps most of the rest of us in check. He was a daredevil. He would try anything. And nothing could stop him, really.
So, can I play this bit about?
Yes, play this bit.
Okay, this is after your brother Walter.
Right. While Dad sweated out the $5 or $10 a month to pay off each of those doctors, Mother was usually around when the accident happened and was just grateful that we survived. She blamed it on heavenly protectors. When the little dears are asleep at night, I can visualize the relief of their guardian angels. They shake hands, kick off their shoes, sprawl across the foot of the boys' beds with a, "Phew, thank God that day is over." Mother made those dresses. Here's Walter. Dad's got his hands on Walter. My father paid $2,200 for the house on the corner of Rodman Street and Sweet Fern Lane. And
$1,000 of it was paid for by the pastor.
That's right. That's right. Audio visual equipment. Let me tell you how the Burke Family Singers got started. I heard the press wrote the same story about how we said the rosary, and afterwards somebody said, "Why don't we sing something?" That's the only story I ever heard until I interviewed each one of my brothers and sisters for about 2-3 hours. Some maybe even 4. I had a whole list of questions, and I was getting to something there. Do you have any idea what it was, Karen?
How you heard a couple stories about how?
Oh, right. The
Burke
story
family started.
2 of them. My sister Florrie and my brother Steve told me the same story that I'd never heard before. Dad was aggravated. It was Christmas Eve, and he was trying to take a little nap before he had to do the midnight mass. And back then there were 5 masses on a Friday on a Saturday morning and Sunday morning, because everybody went to church. It was kind of a different time. So Florrie and Steve were trying to learn the Carol of the Bells, and they were learning it wrong. And my father, for somebody with perfect pitch who's like half asleep, it was torture. He got up and he said, "You're singing it wrong." And he got the music from the top of the piano, and he began to teach them. And he listened to them and how quickly they learned, and how their tone, and then he got this idea. He wondered if all of us could sing. So he called us all down, and there was something different in his voice. We always came quickly when Dad called, but he was excited about something, and we watched him. He had a 3.5 octave singing range, and he would go as high or as low at, you know, and he asked the kids to match his notes, which they did. And we didn't know what he was doing, but he was actually picking sopranos, altos, tenors, and basses. And he taught, once he had the parts done, he taught them the first line and told them to go up to a bedroom and practice. So then he called everybody down and he said, okay, sing. Music, voices in harmony.
They looked around at each other in amazement at the sound they were making. Everyone was singing and grinning. Dad had his hand over his mouth and he was laughing. That was when Mother came in from the kitchen with a pot in her hand and her jaw down to her kneecaps. She just stared at them wide-eyed. For once, Anne Devine was speechless. They finished singing the line and the place erupted with laughter, applause, hugging, and jumping. Dad looked at Mom and his first words were, "Oh my God, Anne, I think we've really got something here." They had something all right. That night would rearrange our appointment books for the next 12 years.
So we started to sing together. And we learned, oh, this is your cue, sorry. I stepped on your cue. No, go ahead.
In the months that followed, the words flat and sharp were added to our musical vocabulary.
That's it.
Now, my father was a purist and wanted us to learn really good music, polyphony, quivering, chant, Bach, Palestrina, you know, madrigals and stuff. And we did a lot of a cappella singing. Rehearsals were pretty grueling because it was difficult music. And Dad's ear was relentless. He could hear if somebody was off. I will never forget the time he picked Il Bianco e Dolce Cigno, and it's the theme is the song of the dying swan that swans sing right before they die. And it started to get real for us because we got as far as that title in each part for the next 3 hours. Steve started to count, and he counted to 104. If someone was, we were going to die trying to learn this song, Steve started to count as I said that. It wasn't just the constant stopping that set our nerves on edge, it was the way he stopped us. And finally, I'm jumping on you.
Let me play it.
Yeah. This is still a relatively new program.
I will never forget the day he introduced us to Jacob Ockedel's 16th century madrigal, Il Bianco e Dolce Cigno. I am sure none of us will.
Il bianco e dolce cigno cantando amore, ed io piangendo giù al fin del vivermi.
I could tell from watching his face as he sang the melody to us the first time that he loved this song. Interpretation was going to be important because he wanted us to sing it as beautifully as he heard it in his head.
Do you want to say anything more about that? That you counted to how many times?
Steve counted to 104 times. And if somebody was sharp or flat or breathed in the wrong place, came in at the wrong time,
Yeah.
he'd stop us.
So,
We
Until-
were ready to kill him, but we sang it again and again until the very last time when he looked around at us, smiled, and said, "Yes, that's it." You could fool an audience some of the time, but you could never fool his ear. That was what judged our sound.
So the rehearsals were sometimes 4 and 5 hours, and we'd have a half-hour break for lunch. And they could be really, really grueling. But you don't get to create music that sounds like that unless you work hard. In 1962, this all happened. The Burke Family Singers really started in 1958. One thing I didn't mention was Walter, Peter, and I could not hold pitches. Walt was 7, I was 6, and Peter was 4. And we didn't know what was going on in the living room, but we wanted in the worst way. And Dad, told us we just too little. So you saw a picture of Peter and I on the sidelines. It's just because I couldn't hold a note. So we would sit on stage and distract the crowd as best we could. And we did a pretty good job at that, actually. Dad couldn't wait to get us singing in the line. In 1962, we sang at the Boston Gardens with Jimmy Durante. And that was quite an experience. Dad hated surprises, so he got there 2 hours early. And so early that we couldn't get into the building. So he called the electrician, and the electrician let us in. And as he walked us back to our rehearsal room, he said, he says, I've been working at the Boston Gardens for 40 years, but I've never met Jimmy Durante. Gee, I'd love to get a signed photo of him, And a lot of us agreed, sure, but we didn't think a lot of it. But my brother Jimmy filed that, and he whispered in Jimmy Durante's ear. So during the rehearsal, which Jimmy Durante ran, and he was just a bundle of energy on the stage. He was Jimmy Durante. And we're right in this rehearsal, and a lot of us jumped when he said, "Stop the music! Stop the music!" And we looked around. He goes, "Where's the electrician? Give me the electrician!" And the electrician comes up and looks like he's starting to have a really bad day. What's the matter, Mr. Durante? And Jimmy put his arm around his shoulder, and he goes, "Get me the photographer! Where's the photographer?" And of course, Jimmy Durante always had a photographer nearby. And he clicked the shot. He cocked his head with his nose there, and the thing was done. And this chapter, I call it was a small thing. But it wasn't, because now this guy could show that Jimmy Durante was a personal friend, a friend of his. I just loved that. There were a couple of things. While we were waiting to go on, not just before, it was sometime within those 2 hours, his sidekick, and I'm going to forget his name now. Eddie Jackson. Mm-hmm. And he knocked on the door, and my brother Walter opened it, and he said, "Mrs. Burke," he said, "I would think the mother of 10 kids would probably have a needle and thread." Jimmy ripped his jacket on the door someplace, and could you fix it, And my mother got up, "Surely," when she did have, a needle and thread, and she sat there, and we were quietly waiting, just waiting for an hour to pass, and Mother started to laugh at one point, and And she said, after all the years of, sewing corduroys and heels of socks, and I just thought to myself, what in heaven's name am I doing at the Boston Gardens sewing Jimmy Durante's jacket?
Do you have that page 103?
Yeah, I do. I'll just read this because it's the best way to tell you this. They packed 16,000 people into the Boston Gardens that night. It was completely sold out. The place was sold out, and as it got closer to 8 o'clock, we went beyond nervous. We were more like numb. But we had just really kind of started out a couple of years earlier, We were more like numb. We could hear them out there. There were stairs lining up to the stage on the wings, and we lined up on them and waited. Dad wanted us to run on stage in New York showbiz style. It was the first time we'd done that, and I figured I'd be the one to fall on my face before I reached my spot, or maybe I'd just keep going and jog over to the other wing, which I was thinking was a really good idea at that point. The performer on ahead of us had just begun to lead 16,000 people in a sing-along. The sound was terrifying. I looked down and my eye caught a thin yellow trickle of water slowly working its way down the steps. Someone up ahead of me had lost control. I whispered, "Hey, who wet their pants?" And a voice hissed, "Shut up, Sarah." And then we got our cue to run on stage. We got there, we made it to our places, and then looked out at a sea of black. We could hear them all, but we couldn't see a thing past the footlights. The thunderous clapping ended and it got very quiet. This was really different. It was like throwing your voice and yourself out into a great void. We stood closer together and Dad tried to calm us with his eyes. The microphones brought our little voices to every part of that large house. It felt as if the audience was leaning forward, listening intently and politely. We couldn't see them watching us. Hold up. We couldn't see them watching us with interest. We could only feel it in the silence and then in the roar of the applause. We sang our 5 or 6 songs and then ran off stage, which I noticed was much easier than running on. Jimmy Durante came on after us and the place went crazy. So that was one of our earlier experiences.
How did that sound? Can I ask you that? How did that sound when you did that? I mean, in terms of acapella, the tone of the building with...
It was beautiful. Their sound system was such that everybody could hear us. They were really quiet too. But to look out when you're standing on the stage and the footlights have blinded you from the people that you want to be looking at. But maybe it was a good idea that I couldn't see how many were there.
If you're interested in that, we might have time to do the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, because that's another one about how does it sound.
I was just thinking of, if you're in a building and you're singing and there's no audience, because you maybe rehearse somewhere along the way, that's one sound. But when you've got that audience there, that changes the percussion of the whole building.
Oh, it does. It changes the acoustics. But
acoustics.
yeah, they were used to that place. I mean, they planned. Their sound system was beautiful, as I recall.
Tell us how about working with the Trapp family.
Oh, I was going to shoot to the sound of music.
Sound of Music. Cool. Okay.
We made 2 albums in 1964, and we spent 4 or 5 days in New York to make this album, and we did it 2 different times. But there is, let me just get the page here. 6. We were staying at the City Squire Hotel, right in the middle of New York City, and we were tourists, okay, and there was a photographer with us, and just in case we didn't make enough of a scene. My sisters had sewn woolen capes with pillbox hats, so the 5 girls were Jackie Kennedy lookalikes, and the boys had these red long coats. So the next day, all right, we went sightseeing in New York. We not only saw the sights, we became one of them. The green capes and the boys' matching red wool overcoats drew stares from passers-by. A photographer traveled with us, snapping pictures, and just in case we didn't attract enough attention, Dad decided to sing in almost every place we stopped. Now, he had 2 pitch pipes, one in each pocket, and he could just blow one note because he had taught the altos, tenors, and basses to learn their first note, learn the relation between their note and the sopranos. So he just had to blow one note, and his mother, his wife, who was a lady tenor, my mother was, and we break into 4 and 5 part harmony just like that. It was pretty incredible. We sang at the Christmas Carousel at the Lever Brothers Plaza, and again across 5th Avenue at the Rockefeller Plaza. The doors were open at Carnegie Hall. So we sneaked in, and Dad asked the cleaning ladies who were sweeping around the seats if they'd like to hear a song. They loved the idea and sat down while we got on the stage. We sang Santa Lucia for the 2 Italian ladies who got teary-eyed and clapped like crazy. Then we sang an Irish song for the one with the brogue, and she was proud of us. They clapped and we bowed. Then Dad turned back to us and whispered, "Now you can honestly say that you sang at Carnegie Hall."
No, you want to talk about
Oh, right.
Nancy Dussault and Don Cook.
During one of these photo shoots, we were singing a Christmas carol, and we were joined by 2 very capable voices, Nancy Dussault and Donald Cook, who were the leads in The Sound of Music, which had just come out in 1960.
On Broadway.
On Broadway, yeah. And they invited us to come see the show. And we said, oh, we tried, but we knew there was, we were poor. We were really poor when I was young. We knew they couldn't afford Broadway tickets. So we got back, when we got back to the hotel, there was a phone message from the producer of The Sound of Music, Leland Haywood. And so Buck Spur, which was the name of our agent, he said, he's the producer of The Sound of Music. So Dad went up to his room to return the call. Is this where you come in, Miss Karen?
Sure.
All right.
After the initial pleasantries, Dad said, "Oh, we'd love to." That was when some of us started silently jumping up and down like pogo sticks, while others twisted and jerked and boogalooed their way across the room. John did his James Brown slide, swung into a tight spin, then went down on the carpet in a split. He pulled himself up using legs only and then went into the funky chicken. All this in complete silence while Dad tried to talk on the phone.
The sound of music, ring up the drums and beat on heat. Right upward curtains and
That's us in the past.
from paper packages tied up with string. These are a few of my favorite things.
Most of us had never seen a stage play, much less a Broadway show.
And it was very exciting. They saved 12 seats right like second or third row. I was amazed at how they could do that, but they sat us there. And then afterwards, they sang for us and we sang for them.
On the stage.
On the stage, after everybody had left. But some people heard us and were starting to come back in. In 1963, we did the Ed Sullivan Show. And that was just an incredible experience as well. I think it was 3 or 4 days taping. It was a live audience, but it was taped. And it was, I would say, the highlight of our singing career. Actually, the people from Ed Sullivan called my father twice. The first time, my father, we had a gig. It was a really small, really local gig at Bishop Fenwick High School. And, you know, I write in the book, was it going to be opportunity or integrity? So my brother Johnny was writing an autobiography at this point, and he writes about this. Mother saved all this stuff. There's no way I could have written this book without her torn notes and all that. But my brother John said, Dad almost blew his stack, but the gig, it couldn't be helped. And Dad assured them that any other time that we would love to come. And he figured that was it, that's dead now. And but they called again a couple of months later. So the Ed Sullivan Show, let me see where I am here. 208.
Page 208,
Yep.
about Ray Block and the orchestra.
Oh yeah. I didn't know that my father could orchestrate. While we were sightseeing, he was in his hotel room, writing out parts for the Bach Alleluia without benefit of piano. One time I saw him, he was staring at a piece of music, and I said, "Can you hear that?" And he goes, "Yeah." I said, "How can you hear that?" He said, "I know what each note sounds like." And as a kid, I just went, "Yeah, okay." I kind of walked away. It was 3 days of afternoon rehearsals, and having a real orchestra backing us up was really something. Okay, I'm gonna read this part here. On the second day of the rehearsal, Dad passed out the parts he'd written, and then Ray Block lifted his baton, and Dad grinned at us and raised his hands. One of them counted 1, 2, 3, and then everybody began playing and singing like crazy. Big sound all around us. Grinning violinists. They didn't get to play this long-haired music too often on the Ed Sullivan Show, and they were getting into it. Some of the instruments were playing my second alto part as I sang it, but I couldn't figure out which ones. Just a note about this, there were 2 altos in my family. Gemma was, when we broke up, Gemma was the first alto section, and I was the second alto section. I was 11 years old in 1963, so it was quite a time. Anyway, everything was moving so fast that I had all I could do to hold on to my part. Then the music stopped and another sound began, tapping. We were still sort of dazed by the size of the sound that had just ended. And now we watched as the orchestra members began to tap their violins with bows or pluck their strings. Popping sounds, like the whole room was an open bottle of champagne. The low rumble of the bass fiddles, the high trilling of the wind instruments, and the tapping. Ray Block used his baton to tap his music stand. We were thoroughly bewildered by this activity. Mom and every one of us kids were at a complete loss. Had we done something wrong? It didn't look that way. They were all smiling at us. We looked over to Dad, and he was beaming. No, he looked like he could have died right then and there, and that would be all right with him. So
shall I play the
do,
bit from the Ed Sullivan Show?
That night, the sponsors for the show were Lipton Tea, Anderson, Pillsbury, and Kent Cigarettes. That night, we performed with an orchestra. That night, we all drank a glass of champagne back at the city square, clinked our glasses together, and toasted each other. That night, I looked out the hotel window at the night lights below, and felt like I owned the place.
This is what we sang on the Ed Sullivan Sounds very cool. So sweet.
We were touring, once we started touring, we were going into the South right during the middle of the civil rights stuff. We actually sang in Montgomery the day after the March from Selma in 1965 because we had a concert in Montgomery that had been set up, and it was a 2,000-seat sold-out house. But when we got there, just to give you an example of how tense it was, there were 18 gray Alabama State Trooper cars at our motel alone. They were everywhere. And they brought their families into the motels. They were afraid of retaliation. I don't know why, because the blacks had no power at all at that time. I want to tell you a story about one of the first concerts we sang down there. One thing we had to get used to immediately was every time Steve would start to sing Dixie, he'd just start, I wish I was in the, and everybody got up, they stood up. And Dad was directing us, and he turned around, and Steve just kept on singing. So we sang the whole thing. It was like it was their national anthem. Now you don't hear Dixie played that much, but we played it in every concert. We played America the Beautiful, a medley of Negro spirituals, which is what they called them then.
So I'll play Dixie.
Yeah, do.
That was one powerful song.
Turn up.
When we sang Dixie at George and Dave's restaurant in Gallatin, Tennessee, Dave tore up the bill. And it was after we sang Dixie in Rock City, Georgia, that a very dignified old white lady slowly approached us. She was wearing an elegant, broad-brimmed straw hat and walked with the help of a silver-headed cane. Everything about her was unhurried. She came to a stop in front of Mom and Dad, leaned forward with both hands on the cane in front of her, and looked directly at them as she drawled, "Well, I can't tell you how good it does this old southern heart of mine to hear you damn Yankees singing Dixie." We all laughed, but we knew she meant it.
That was that one. In one of the first tours, we went down to Pine Bluff, Arkansas. We were asked to sing at A.M.N. College in Pine Bluff, and we didn't know it was an all-black school, and they didn't know we were a white family. And recently I have discovered, as I looked through YouTube and stuff, there was a black family. There is a black family called the Burke Family Singers. So I'm wondering if they thought they were getting the black family. Well, they got us instead. And I remember feeling that I was experiencing what it was to be a minority. There were no white people around. And these black people, segregation was the rule down south at that time. us singing for them was the very sort of thing that they'd been working towards, just sitting at lunch counters and stuff. But they felt uncomfortable as well as pleased. The first couple of songs we sang, they hardly clapped, and we were used to packed houses because everybody went to see if the college is giving a concert or something. People really went back then, and now there's too much input. We're all getting way too much input, but
You were feeling awkward, and so he switched the program.
That's right. And he said Dixie. And for some reason, us singing it to them, they went crazy. They were really clapping hard. That's what we were used to. And Dad never switched the program, so the whole thing was quite unusual. Some people came back at the intermission, and that was really unusual too.
So let me play this a little bit, okay? Because this is after
Yeah.
you play the Negro spirituals.
The applause that followed was thunderous. I don't know if it was just the song Dixie or the fact that white people from the North were singing it to this particular group, but the place went crazy. Still on the piano, Dad followed it up with a medley of Negro spirituals. Behold that star, Mary had a baby, and Go Tell It on the Mountain. Dad had the solo and was using us as backup. He'd certainly found something to do with his nervous energy, and he was wailing.
Behold that star, behold that star up yonder, behold that star. It is the star of Bethlehem.
I'm the short girl.
Behold that star, behold that star up yonder, behold that star. It is the star of Bethlehem. Well, the wise men came on from the east. It is the star of Bethlehem. For him who was born free from sin. It is the star of Bethlehem. Behold that star. Behold that star. Behold that star. It is the star of Bethlehem.
You want to
Okay,
jump?
I'm going to interrupt for just a minute to tell you about that particular song, because what happened was we had to get permission, licensing permissions for all 36 of the clips that are in this audiobook. And it was very complicated because a lot of the producers and the composers and so on were in the 60s, and it was hard to find them. And we finally found the copyright owner of the 2 albums that the family put out in the 60s, and that man would not give us permission
To use
to
our own
use
music.
the family music, and we had chosen 15 songs of the 36 from those 2 albums.
Thinking we could use them. It didn't occur to us that somebody would really withhold that.
And we went through a lawyer and everything, and the lawyer said,
Entertainment lawyer offered money.
don't do it, because he can sue you $150,000 for each song that we were going to use.
This is music business.
So instead, we went back into the family archives and we found 12 other versions of 12 songs. We found other versions, younger voices, less refined, you know.
So the end result is that it's not, this audiobook musically is not as slick
Yeah.
as we had planned.
You can
And
really
it-
hear the youthful voices.
Yeah, and it's had its own way, this whole process anyway.
So the reason I'm mentioning this is because that particular song we could not find another version of, along with 2 others. So we called the Burke Family Singers one at a time and said, would you come into the studio and re-sing those songs? Now this is 50 years later. We just did this in January. And we got 5 of them. Luckily, they covered all the parts with 5 of them. Sarah sang a few parts. And we laid down the bass track for each of those 3 songs, and then each one would put on headsets and sing against the bass track in order to add more voices, so it sounded like 12. So 3 of the songs were just recorded in January. That was one of them, 50 years later.
We sang with the Traps in 1964 at their lodge in Stowe, Vermont. Maria Von Trapp and 2 of her kids, Johannes and Rosemarie. And we went to the lodge and we were there for 4 days. And they had a lot of snow. And it was really tense, some of the rehearsals, because Dad wanted us to sing as best as, because he loved the Traps. He had their albums and stuff. From the moment we started to perform, we were compared to the Traps. Matter of fact, the press dubbed us the American Trap Family, which totally, that stuck. We kept running into Maria Von Trapp. She was on a book tour. She had written a book called The Trap Family Singers, and we ran into her in the Mormon Tabernacle in Utah, and a couple of other places where she was speaking or had just spoken. When the CBS trucks came up from New York for those 3 or 4 days taping, it was magical. I expected to see Bing Crosby come out of one of these trucks, holding a pipe and humming to himself or something, It was just a really exciting time. As I said, the music was tense. It was tense. The first thing, we didn't know them, and the first thing Dad suggested that we all sing together. So we sat around their kitchen table, and Maria's an alto, so she sat in between Gemma and I, and that was really cool.
So I'm going to play this.
Yeah.
Singing together was a wonderful idea. We didn't really know these people. Both Trapp children were very shy and reserved, and Maria was polite but tentative. Dad rightly guessed that the best and quickest way for us to warm up to each other was to sing together. Both families knew from years of experience the power music had to warm and communicate, and when he suggested that we all sing Stille Nacht around the table, he knew exactly what he was doing.
Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht,
This picture is from the TV show.
Yeah. The idea was we're caroling for Maria. She had real candles in the tree. I'm not surprised the place burned down. That's another time.
For the Trapps, it was clearly as comfortable as putting on a warm pair of thick woolen socks. We could see the recognition on their faces as they listened while they sang, like they were hearing from an old friend. And of course, we Burkes thought the combo was pretty fabulous and grinned shamelessly as we flexed our musical muscles.
I'm very soon going to be wrapping this up, but I'd like to tell you about singing for the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. We were finishing up a tour, and this tour we went the length of Canada. I wonder if you folks know, it's not PEI, because that's on the east side of it. What is the island on the western part of Canada?
Part of British.
What?
It's part of British.
Yeah.
Vancouver.
Vancouver. That's it.
Right. Yeah. Well, Dad really wanted, we were close enough to Utah that Dad wanted to drive there.
Yeah, if close is 350 miles.
That was close. Sometimes we traveled 500 miles. We traveled in 2 Chevrolet station wagons, 3 in the front, and 3 in the back, and 3 in the front, and 3 in the back. And the license plates for the cars, the lead car was Songs, and the follow car was Credo. And my parents split up in case there was a car accident. There would be one parent alive to take care of the rest of us.
So there you were at the Mormon Tabernacle.
Thank you.
You got there just in time for the last tour of the day.
And they do this thing where they have this podium. It's a really big hall where they drop a pin, and we were way far away, and we heard it. And as soon as we heard it, we all looked at Dad because we knew he wanted to sing here in the worst way. So we sang something. I don't know what it was, but the tour guide, he got excited, and he said, "Could you excuse me?" So he called. He got on the phone, I guess, with Mr. Condi, the director of, and they invited us to sing for them. And my father said, "Oh, we'd love to." They said, "Did you know that the rehearsals are Thursday nights?" And that's when we just happened to be there. So that was totally cool. And it was kind of terrifying, though, when you think of what the acoustics were. And we were used to looking down at audiences. And these are bleachers, and they are 386 professional singers. And we're looking up like this.
No pressure.
There were so many altos that I wrote, you could set up a lemonade stand here and nobody would even know. So, we sang.
You sang
A couple of tunes.
Tuas Petrus and Il Bianco.
Il Bianco e Dolce Cigno. We sang that one. And the last one we sang was Hospedi Pomilui, which is, it's from the Russian masses, and it means Lord have mercy, and you sing it 75 times. So,
I'll play this.
yeah, play it.
Sorry about that.
From the moment we started to sing it, we noticed the choir members grinning and looking at one another. Something was going on.
We were nudging each other.
The applause was thunderous at the end of it, and Mr. Condi explained that the choir had tried to sing Hospedi Pomilui right there in the tabernacle, and they couldn't do it. Not with these acoustics. There were too many of them, and the sound kept bouncing all around the hall. The sections were too far apart and couldn't hear to hold on to their parts.
Yeah.
Jem and I looked at each other again, feeling like David to their Goliath.
Hospedi Pomilui, 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 Hospedi Pomilui.
You get the idea. Yeah. So I'll let it fade out. We don't need to hear all 75 of them.
Right. I'm
Breathe
going
at
to
the
wrap.
end. What do you mean? Breathe at the end.
That's right.
I'm going to wrap this up by talking about the Black Hills and seeing Mount Rushmore. Do I read this next, Miss Karen?
And that's, I can just play it if you want.
Sure, go for it.
Later that day, we drove into the Black Hills National Forest, and as the shadows lengthened, we hurried to see Mount Rushmore before it got dark.
There's the cars.
We made it up the steep, winding road and arrived at the viewing area as the sun began to set. I don't think there could have been a better time to see it. There was no one there. No park ranger, no cars, not a soul there but us. Steve and Dad shut the car motors off, and then there was complete silence. We got out of the cars and just stood there, looking at this incredibly large monument carved out of the rock face. Presidents Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Roosevelt. Nobody said anything. We just stood there. It felt holy, a moment not to be forgotten. Like God had cleared the place out so that we'd have this special gift without distractions. For 3 years now, we had been traveling across this beautiful country, and in those years, President Kennedy had been shot, The Vietnam War continued to escalate amid increasing student protest, and the civil rights movement was in full swing. There was so much going on in the country, so much struggle, and here were four who had played such a major role in the shaping of it. Dad broke the silence. He said, "America the Beautiful," and then blew a note on the pitch pipe he always carried in his pocket. We sang it to the hills and to those giant faces across the valley. We prayed it, and the prayer moved us. As the silence replaced the last echo of sound and the sun set, we stood there a few moments longer and then quietly got into the cars. Not a word was spoken. And for my family, that's saying something.
That's it.
Do you have any, if you have any questions,
Yeah.
I'm happy to. Yes.
I come from a big family too, 9 of us, my husband 7.
Oh, wow.
So it just resonates with me as far as the big family goes, and the only thing we really did as a family was we prayed the rosary together, but singing together was amazing. But how was, your father, was he strict? I mean, there must have been some serious strict rules there as far as not just singing, but obviously, I mean, did anybody get out of line and the law was late or?
We were young enough, I think, and we loved to sing. All of a sudden we got to get new clothes and travel and see the country. We got out of school. I was like, how perfect is this? In the spring and in the fall is when we toured.
But before you started touring, there were so many little kids. And her dad, at one point, I think it's in one of the early chapters, he decided to lay down the law and set up a schedule for which older kids were going to wake up which younger kids at what minute of what hour, and who was going to make the toast and cereal, and who was going to dress.
We followed it too. Yeah, he was strict.
So,
and my mother countered that with, she didn't want our spirits to get squelched either. So the two of them, they were both, you knew it when either one of them walked into a room, because they were very capable of a presence.
yeah.
Thank you very much for coming.
Yeah, and know that this audiobook is actually in this library. So you can
If
take
you want
it
to take it
out.
out.
If you want to buy one for a Christmas present, we have them here, but it's also available right in the library.
So I'd like to thank you very much, Sarah Jo, for coming
Thank
this
you.
evening and for really giving us a whole new insight on, times, a couple of years back and how life was different then in terms of what people did for entertainment. And I think it's just a beautiful story of how a family worked together, and I think that's something that is very inspiring for us nowadays, given, sort of the situation with families and there's lots of different configurations.
My parents watched the Traps, and they stayed together for a really long time. And there were repercussions of that, because they needed to be individuals, I think, but they also needed to eat You know, so my parents wanted the Burke Family Singers to have a natural ending. And that's just what happened. Steve got married in September, and my two sisters, Marty and Florrie, in November had a double wedding. And Matt pretty much. We did a couple of TV shows after that, but mostly Florrie lived in Ohio, so, you know, getting together for the type of rehearsing that is needed for this kind of music, you know. So I never wanted it to end. No way. I loved it, you know, but I was younger. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you.